At the beginning of your question, you characterized LSD. It's that it is a non-specific amplifier, but of the contents of the personal unconscious and the sensorium. What people notice about LSD is either what's right or wrong with themselves, or how freaky the world is. You know, a bug, a drop of water, it can be anything, but you discover the strangest things on LSD, and they're real things. I mean, relationships of reflections and windows, and I mean, it basically seems to be a tremendous amplifier of attention and analysis of the input of attention when directed into the outer world, and when directed into the inner world, it's an analytical tool for looking at past history of the individual, which is what I call the personal unconscious. The thing that always puzzled me about enthusiasts of LSD was that they claimed that beyond this lie what they called the white light, which they put great store by and made all kinds of Buddhist associations to it. I don't know if I've ever had the white light experience. As I go deeper into strong psychedelics, what happens is multiplicity proliferates. There is not a simplifying. There is a further and further and further complexifying. And I was talking to someone at Ojai Foundation about this, and they said, but surely beyond all this, there is some kind of simplification and unity. And I said, well, that I wasn't sure, that maybe it's just, you know, an infinite samsaric ocean in all directions, in all dimensions, forever. Ketamine comes closer to providing a no observer, nothing observed kind of state, but you can't do much with that. You can have it, but there is, of course, with the dropping of all boundaries, a feeling of release. But what I'm interested in are bringing back artifacts to share with the tribe. And I've accepted that they will come in the form of either things that can be painted or things that can be said. And since I'm better at the saying than the painting, I work like that. Stan is a good friend of mine. We've talked about this over the years. I just can't confirm his maps of the psyche. I don't see those states occurring along a continuum the way that he says they do. I think it's much more chaotic, and that if his categories work to facilitate psychotherapy, then that's good, because that's what he's interested in. In other words, I see his maps as very, very provisional and useless and useful for navigating. But I doubt that when we get the final maps, if we ever do, that they will bear terrifically much resemblance to that. And I think he would agree with that. I mean, we're not at loggerheads about this. Anybody who works with psychedelics, their ultimate position is that, hell, they don't know. One of the things that's so striking about shamanism in the native context is the absence of mental illness, the absence of serious neurotic patterns of behavior. This is because this translinguistic reality is allowed to work its will through shamanism, is allowed to regulate the society. In other words, our model of how society works is we are at war with nature, and we must push it back, seize a beachhead, fortify our position, dig in, these kinds of metaphors, metaphors of capture and control. While the shamanic approach is we must communicate with nature in order that nature can communicate with us, in order that we may know what should be done. And shamanism, as classically practiced, is hunting magic, weather magic, healing magic. In other words, ways of getting into the evolving of state-bound system patterns within nature. Weather, we would presume, can to some degree be predicted by looking at past weather states. Hunting can to some degree be predicted by looking at the migration and movement of game in past situations. So shamanism then becomes a kind of mnemonic exercise where by keeping track of what has happened, you can build up a model of what will happen. And originally this was done through great mnemonic feats of memory, like the Yugoslavian folktale singers or the Homeric epics or the people who sang the Edda. These were, works of hundreds of thousands of lines that were passed down virtually without change over millennia. But there's a strange phenomenon at least in the evolution of cultures, and perhaps more generally, which is every step into freedom contains within it the potential for greater bondage. Now, what I mean by that is, here's an example of it. Women in charge of the gathering phase in hunting gathering cultures developed language, I believe, because they had great need of the ability to make fine distinctions. In other words, here you have 50 grasses, small herbs, shrubs. They have roots, fruits, berries, seeds, inflorescences. Some of these things are poisonous. Some of these things are foods. Some grow in the spring, some in the fall, some along the river courses, some on the hilltops, so forth and so on. A great many descriptive dimensions come to bear on this. So consequently, I think women are to be held responsible for the evolution of language in order to discuss the extremely important matter of what is good to eat and what is not, and where do you find it, and how do you preserve it, and what do you combine it with, and so forth and so on. Men, on the other hand, who were in charge of the hunting because of the different body type and bladder capacity and so on, the premium there was placed on silence, stoicism, being able to stalk and for days make no noise, possibly, and to just, sort of integrate into this silent kind of thing. Well, this same kind of freedom which binds occurred in the shamanic effort to steer culture by mnemonic means, because eventually even the greatest of the shamanic memory artists were overwhelmed by the amount of data, by the size of the epics, by the sheer length of these genealogies. So then symbolic notation is brought in, and shamanism turns into scribecraft, and signifying magical forces turns into writing down their names, and there is a tremendous binding, a compression, a limitation of freedom because the strategy of freedom became too successful. So this reaching beyond ourselves is a process that is continuous. We transcend a state, we then lock ourselves into the transcendent state. It becomes defined by its own set of limitations, and we move beyond it. And this kind of bootstrapping mechanism, I think, has been at work throughout the evolution of language, throughout the evolution of shamanism. Now we have come to a similar kind of bind having to do with the bankruptcy of analytical analysis and rationalism, which has led us to a pretty complete mastery of inert matter. But when pushed into the quantum realm, suddenly contradictions begin to multiply and impossible conclusions force themselves upon the investigator. Well, what this means is that rationalism has simply reached its limit. There is no reason to think that it doesn't have a limit. It was just the inflated fantasy of the 17th century that thought that God's mind must work like the mind of a watchmaker. But in fact, what with chaos theory and catastrophism and numerous other non-equilibrium partial differential processes in nature, we now know that nature is extremely unpredictable, highly variable, not subject to analytical understanding except in very limited domains. What this understanding that quantum physics has brought the physicists and that the psychedelic state has brought the people who pursue that, it has not fed back into the mainstream of society. We're still living in a male-dominated, object-dominated, subject-other kind of world model, a world model inherited from the 18th century, really even more than from the 19th century. Well, is it going to kill us? Is it too late? What can we do about it? This is what I talked about last night about the archaic revival as the notion of making a sharp left turn away from the momentum that the historical vehicle wants to follow, which is thanatoptic. Don't kid yourself. And you cannot have three religions stacked up on top of each other, stretching back 4,000 years, pursuing this monotheistic vision, which ends in an apocalypse, without building a tremendous morphogenetic predilection for the apocalypse. And our demonic investigations into matter have led us to create the machinery to produce the apocalypse. It's interesting, somebody said of the Reagan administration, this was when James Watt was running around saying we didn't have to save the trees because Jesus was coming anyway, so it didn't matter. And someone said, the jerks want to be in the Bible. And that's precisely the historical situation. The jerks want to be in the Bible. In other words, every petty potentate from Frederick Barbarossa to Ronald Reagan has secretly believed that they were living in the time of the Antichrist and would participate in the scenario of the book of Revelation. And this is psychosis if you meet it in a person. If you meet it in a culture, it's called religious piety and conviction. And it has been going on so long that it has actually created a very narrow neck in the historical process that cannot be avoided. We now have no choice in the matter of business as usual. There will not apparently be business as usual. There will either be an apocalyptic destruction of the planet, a kind of Ragnarok, a Götterdämmerung, a complete storm of fire brought on by the eruption of the psychotic mythologies that have driven the matter-centered, monotheistic male ego culture. Or there will be a plucking of victory from the jaws of that defeat, and not an apocalypse, but a kind of cultural millennium, a complete breaking out of the pattern into something else. And some of you may know Riane Eisler's work, The Chalice and the Blade. If you haven't read this book, I recommend it to you. For psychedelic people, for people concerned with the state of society, this is certainly an important book. And what she's saying is partnership. It is not true that the story of the human race is the story of a pendulum swing between matriarchy and patriarchy, each with its own flaws. Rather, it is that human beings have always lived in an equilibrium-style partnership society, except during the last 8,000 years, this pattern has been disrupted by the rise of the male ego, the suppression of the logos-like connection to nature, and a certain evolutionary path taken in the epigenetic coding of information. In other words, the phonetic alphabet. The phonetic alphabet, which has no reference to the icon of the things expressed, is utterly cool, utterly unable then to give you any feeling of engagement with what is being described. This gives permission for analytical science and the detachment of rationalism and the sorts of philosophies that have created the tremendous split between head and heart that characterizes the political systems of the last several hundred years. Well, this thing which the shamans are contacting, which we can call another dimension, hyperspace, the collective unconscious, whatever it is the ground of our becoming. And the only way to sort of unhitch ourselves from the ego is to open pathways of communication to this invisible field of intentionality in which we are embedded. And this is a very difficult task because the culture in which we live denies that this thing even exists. I mean, if you start saying that you feel the heartbeat of the planet or that you are in resonance with the local ecosystem, or still worse, if you say that you hear the voices of elves and fairies, this is psychopathy. Automatically, you have to be observed, sedated, and cured because you're participating in a model of reality that is not consensually validated. Nevertheless, I think what we're trying to do with meetings like this is empower this particular meme, empower this idea. I can't remember who developed the idea of memes, but it's basically the notion that ideas compete with each other the way animals and plants compete in an ecosystem, that ideas adapt and spread and occupy niches and defend territory and redefine environments. And so my mentioning last night of the woman who said to me, I thought I was crazy until I heard you speak. For me, that is really the nugget of this work and the most satisfying kind of comment that anybody could make, because what has happened since the 1960s is the straight people all went off together. And by this, I don't refer to sexual preference. I use straight in the earlier sense. The straight people all went off and became very weird together, with their golden Mercedes and their Picasso ceramics and all that. The freaks all went off and became strange alone, each apart in our own way, because community was shattered, affinity groups were suppressed. People went all kinds of directions. Now, the people who went through the 60s, approaching or in their 40s, have had 20 years to see how they like that kind of alienated aloneness. And so this morning as we went around, I heard many people saying, that they had done these things in the 60s, but not for a long time, and now they were returning to it. I think this is because it finally dawns on you that, this may be the only shot you've got at it. I mean, reincarnation is fine, past lives are fine, but we're all getting daily older, and we don't know where we came from, what lies beyond the zygote, and we don't know where we're going, what lies beyond the pine box. Who can say? So out of the incredible mystery of whatever the universe is, a microsecond of opportunity against impossible odds has sprung into being. We are embedded in that moment of opportunity. So what are you going to do with it? You're going to sweep up around the ashram for 30 years and then decide that was a mistake? Or, are you going to just give yourself over to the arms of Holy Mother Church for a lifetime? I mean, people do this. You cannot escape making some kind of commitment to something. Nobody gets through life without being asked to sign up, either in their own club or somebody else's. The mushroom said to me once, in the way that it does when it delivers these aphorisms, it said, you must have a plan. If you have no plan, you will become part of somebody else's plan. You either have a plan or you are part of somebody else's plan. And so I think people are waking up to the fact that we must use what works. Because you see, someone on this side of the room, when we went around, talked about yoga and how the psychedelic gives the experience on demand, but are we ready, and how do you gain skills, and this sort of thing. To my mind, the goal is not the psychedelic experience. The beginning of the path is the psychedelic experience. So if yoga promises that after 20 years it will deliver you to the beginning of the path, then, there's something seriously wrong here.